Okay, so we're going to look at of education, having had a brief, well, it wasn't that brief, but it was a relatively brief considering the momentousness of the work Areopagitica's defense of free speech, which isn't really a defense of free speech. It's a defense of freedom for the purposes of advancing truth and for the purposes of cultivating the mind of Christ in vanquishing the sinful tares which are interwoven in the affairs of this world. It's not defending all speech. It's not without limits. He's happy to have books banned after they pass through a sufficient process, like a church council or so forth. The main thing is he doesn't want the licensing process to precede the publication of the document concerned. But of course, he is happy for certain types of books to be banned because of their malevolence and their malign effect on the public. Of Education was also at first an anonymous publication. It's an 8-page quarto sheet. This will be the beginning of it here. It's presented as a letter written to a Puritan educational reformer by the name of Samuel Hartleb, and it is Milton's most fulsome publication on how to reform education. And it has a dual objective. On the one hand, it's to fit a man for public service, and it's stated there right early in the beginning. Actually, there's nothing more of that there, so I can't flip it down. It is here. To fit a man to perform justly, skillfully, and magnanimously all the offices, both public or private and public, of peace and war. So it fits you for public life. And that is something that can easily be overlooked, but it is specifically intended for a particular audience. This is not education. You have to close it again. It just flew open. Education for everyone. He has in mind education for the nobility, in the same way that Martin Luther directs a early work of his to the noblemen of Germany. And I think that needs to be kept in consideration here. He is proposing this for those who have the leisure and the station to execute their offices as aristocrats in the country. So it's to fit a man to perform justly, skillfully, and magnanimously all the offices, both private and public, of peace and war. And it also has a private aim, and the private aim seems much more comprehensive, and it might lie in conflict with the first, I would say, reductionist appeal to the aristocracy, and we can apply it later on. But it is to repair the ruins of our first parents by regaining to know God aright, and out of that knowledge to love him, to be like him, as we may the nearest by possessing our soul of true virtue. That latter quote is one I quote regularly when defending education. And what I want people to know in this, or to note in that declaration, is that he regards education primarily as an act of recovery. If you're in my C.S. Lewis class, progressive views of education regard education as looking forward towards new things that have never been said or uttered. The whole process in universities of obtaining a doctorate is you have to introduce some new insight, a new discovery. If it's in the realm of the sciences, it's sort of obvious. In the humanities, it becomes less so obvious how you can do something genuinely new. But the aim is here not to discover what is new, but rather to recover what is old and has been lost. And that difference in perspective is significant. It gives us a different view of the past and also of what constitutes a good education, and also what the model of a good education will be. And the model of a good education, of course, will be an unfallen Adam and Eve. And we don't have much by way to illustrate what an unfallen Adam and Eve will be like in terms of the Genesis text, because they fall pretty quickly. But we do have a sense of what is intended by that in the form of the second Adam, Jesus Christ. We have a great deal that we can discern from how he acts, how he thinks, how he judges, how he understands, that I think can be exemplary, and his attitude towards the past even. So Jesus says, I've come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. He's reading the Old Testament and engaging with the Old Testament when he speaks, and he's commenting on it, and therefore regards it highly. So there's a rootedness in the canon of Scripture, which is exemplary in Jesus' own teaching and life, that I think becomes exemplary in Milton's estimation of these things as well. But it's, in that sense, it looks backwards. It's a recovery. It's trying to understand what's already been written and to make sure that we learn lessons from that. It's not primarily for the purposes of inventing new things, creating new technological devices, giving people STEM education so that they can get jobs. That is never in Milton's view. Not interested in that per se. That's a progressive educational, very utilitarian view of education. Or for gaining financial wealth. That's not, again, there's going to be nothing of that. Or to advance society in new ways, or to exercise further dominion in ways that have never been thought before. Through new technologies, through new ideas of humanity extending into time and space and so forth. It's very much more grounded, and it's rooted in a sense that what is deeply part of the fabric of creation is fundamentally good because God created it so. And it remains so despite the fallenness of the world and the fallenness of human nature. And so we're to restore the ruins of our first parents. And how? By regaining to know God aright. So there's the first point. And it's a key point. And it might not seem like a very shocking point, but the history of Christian education doesn't always agree with this point. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, in particular in relation to the classical education movement, because classical education very much sounds like what Milton is recommending to us, which actually in some ways he is. But there are different types of classical education. But in our day, amongst Christian circles, amongst homeschoolers as well, classical education is what people are after. They want to engage with the great books, and I teach the great books. But how do you teach the great books? And what is the methodology? What is the hermeneutic? How do you intend to relate to the great books? You know, how do I engage with Homer? And how do I engage with Virgil? How do I engage with Dante? How do I engage with any text? And as a Christian, there are differences in perspective on that have been taken over the history of Christianity even. And Milton's makes a very clear statement when he says that it is to restore the ruins of our first parents by regaining to know God aright. That's the aim. It's by doing that. And out of that knowledge, the telos, the end, is to love him, to be like him, and so that we meet us by possessing our soul of true virtue. So it's backward looking in the sense, but it's also upward looking, and then it is imitative of him. So it's Christological in its focus. And that will be an emphasis of the Reformation, which is marked by an intense focus on Christology. So you'll know about the solas of the Reformation: sola fide, sola gratia, sola Christus, sola scriptura, etc. Those are going to be embedded in Milton's view. And there are different ways of approaching classical education that have been presented in the history of Christian education that are going to be very happy to read the Greeks and the Romans, but not have the same vantage point that Milton takes here. And amongst, when I say Milton takes it, this is very common with the reformers of his day, the chief of whom is a man by the name of John Amos Comenius, who writes a splendid work, which I read 2 summers ago. He has a variety of it, but Comenius is a champion of universal education. Now, Milton is not proposing universal education, by the way, but he champions it and presents it in a work called Didactica Magna. But there are a variety of works here. He's a Czech reformer. And he travels all over Europe, including being influential on this man, Samuel Hartley, which is interesting. So when Milton is addressing this treatise of education to Hartley, he's engaging with the philosophy of Comenius, educational philosophy of Comenius. He talks about the garden of the soul, which Milton regularly appeals to in his work in Paradise Lost, among other things. Talks about the world as a garden, uses the garden metaphor, and that so it's an Adamic metaphor, the garden, the dominion, the things that are to be found in the garden, etc., and thereby to direct our labors. And he influences education throughout the Western world. Comenius does. I'm not here to talk about Comenius, but he is influential on, I think it's sufficient just to say, on Hartley, and Milton is engaging with him. So it's not universal education, but he regularly appeals to the idea of knowledge as a garden. And Comenius does that as well, and he's surely read Comenius. But that view of starting with the Bible and Christian theology and Christian ethics ahead of pagan writings, or alongside and comparing, contrasting, is the Reformed view in general. And you might say, isn't that obvious? And the answer is, it might be obvious to you, but it's not obvious to, in the history of Christianity, that be the way to educate and use the classics. If you go to, and I used to teach this in my lit theory course, and I've dropped it now because I just had too much material. But St. Basil writes an address to young men. St. Basil, one of the great fathers of the Eastern Church, and he argues that when teaching virtue, they should become initiated in the pagan writings first, and then only after that give special heed to the sacred and divine teachings. Because to look at the divine teaching is the light is too bright. So let's accustom ourselves to the sun as we see it in the reflection in the water before we actually go to the light of the sun itself. And it's something akin to what you see in Dante, where he begins in the Inferno with the description of Aristotle's ethics and the various layers of hell. He starts with the pagan writings, even as a pagan, lead him up to the top of purgatory, and only then gets to Christian writing. That's an educational paradigm that you find in St. Basil, but I think you will find, I will argue that that's more Platonic than it is Christian. So you start with a shadow, and then you move to the real substance. That's not the Protestant approach to it. The Protestant approach is one that I would say you can find in the Church Fathers, but it's not St. Basil, it's Augustine. And in Augustine, I regularly cite, and I should have put this up here, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do it quickly enough now. Augustine on Christian doctrine. Thank you. Oh, very good. Oh, even better. It's too slow. Slow. But the passage I cited earlier, where Augustine talks about using pagan learning, book 2, and makes the comparison to the Egyptians. 9 muses, divination, repudiate divination, human institutions, not all things are superstitious, what contrivances to adopt. I don't know the chapter divisions well enough. This is the problem with me going to this now. I might just have to cite it more or less accurately. Use of rhetoric and dialectic, science of numbers, not created but only discovered by man. So he appeals to the trivium and the quadrivium. And the use of that, where is it? What kind of spirit? Sacred scripture compared with profane authors. There we go. There we go. So chapter 42. I just went past it all by trying to blow it up. Here's the quote. Just as poor as the store of gold and silver and garments which the people of Israel brought with them out of Egypt was in comparison with the riches which they afterwards attained at Jerusalem, and which reached their height in the reign of King Solomon, so poor is all the useful knowledge which is gathered from the books of the heathen when compared with the knowledge of Holy Scriptures. For whatever man may have learned from other sources, if it is hurtful, it is there condemned. If it is useful, it is therein contained. And while every man may find there all that he has learned of useful elsewhere, he will find there in much greater abundance things that are to be found nowhere else, but can be learned only in the wonderful sublimity and wonderful simplicity of the Scriptures. So we will plunder the Egyptians, just as the pagans, or just as Moses and the Israelites were called upon to do of the Egyptians, and use their gold for purposes. But we will find that the gold that we have there is relatively meager in comparison to the quantity and the quality of the gold that we'll find in scriptures. So it's not that there's nothing there. It's just that comparatively it is nothing in comparison to the gold that we find in the Word of God. That's Augustine's emphasis, and it will be Milton's emphasis, and it'll be the Reformers' emphasis. But that doesn't mean that there is no gold there, and it's a particular type of gold, and they're going to want to put it alongside the gold of Scripture and compare and contrast it there. But in general, the Catholic universities that the Reformers are speaking against did not emphasize acquaintance with the Scriptures as the touchstone to discern truth from falsehood. They were well acquainted with the pagan authors, and they would have been encouraged to read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, but they very rarely were able to or did read the Scriptures themselves, let alone as a central plank of their education. Whereas Milton is going to assume and assert that that's the central purpose here, is to know God aright. And you can only know God aright by reading his word. You're not going to do it by reading Aristophanes. Even though he's just said Aristophanes is good, insofar as he mixes good with evil, and it's instructive to a man who knows the truth, but you're not going to know the truth other than by appealing to God's revelation. So it's a significant difference there, and you will find different varieties of education on this front amongst Catholics and Protestants. But I think that here's the quote from Comenius, the famous educator, in the Great Didactic I quoted earlier on. He says, "We see that the chief schools profess Christ in name only, but hold in highest esteem writers like Terence, Plautus, Cicero, Ovid, Catullus, and Tibullus. The result of this is that we know the world better than we know Christ. We know the world better than we know Christ. And that, though in a Christian country, Christians are hard to find. For with the most learned men, even with theologians, the upholders of divine wisdom, the external mask only is supplied by Christ, while the spirit that pervades them is drawn from Aristotle and the host of heathen writers." That's his criticism of the education in the universities that he confronts, and the problem of education as it trickles down to the schools as well. By all means, they should read the heathen authors, but the mask of being Christian is just that it's a mask that uncovers that beneath all of that, they're schooled more by Aristotle than they are by Scripture and what Scripture teaches. Note that Milton's emphasis is extremely different on that. Just from the outset, the way I spoke of that and the emphasis here, that the end then of learning is to repair the ruins of our first parents, by regaining to know God aright. So Milton, like Francis Bacon, it says here in the helpful footnote, believed that before the fall, Adam possessed a pure light of natural knowledge, and that he forfeited this perfect knowledge when he ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Yes, I think that's correct. And we will see that when we come to Paradise Lost, that Adam and Eve are portrayed as having a knowledge and capacity that far exceeds our own. They are brilliant, both of them. They are splendid. We would, if we met an Adam and Eve with the capacities that they have, we would be in awe of them. And the aim of education is to recover that lost, not innocence, because the innocence has been forfeited because of sin. The innocence that we have is given to us in the imputed righteousness of Christ. That's the innocence. But the knowledge itself that they possess, that's the aim, is to recover it. So it's an archaeological exercise, as it were, in that sense. But the knowledge of Christ, or the knowledge of Adam, is to be found in how Christ interprets the Old Testament and how he lives. Because note that what he then says this, just like when Jesus is asked what the greatest commandment is, he says it's to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your strength. That's the greatest commandment. Second one is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. What's the greatest commandment? Where is he getting that from? Deuteronomy 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. You're to love the Lord your God with all your heart. So, and you're to teach your children this. That's what Moses says in Deuteronomy. Jesus is quoting that passage when talking about love, and love then permeates education, properly speaking. And Milton is simply digging down on that when he is citing right here the end of learning, to repair the ruins, to know God aright, and out of that knowledge to love him, to imitate him, to be like him, that we may be the nearest possessing our souls of true virtue, which, being united to the heavenly grace of faith, makes up the highest perfection. So, boom, like huge shift. And it's not, again, there's the Protestant shift on the Catholic education that precedes it, in that Christological emphasis and the emphasis on the ethics of Jesus and the recovery of the ancient text, which Milton knows in abundance, just like his Catholic contemporaries do. But did they have the mind of Christ in the way they engage with it? I'm not going to pass judgment on that. His point is that we need to do that if we're going to truly educate, because God tells us what it means to be educated. Jesus himself tells us what the greatest commandment is, and it is allied as tightly as you could possibly ever want it to be with education. And it's laid upon parents. Remember? In Deuteronomy 6. Teach your children, it says. And then they're to put it on the frontlets between their eyes, they're to put it on their wrists, they're to put it on the doorposts of their homes, and they're to put it on the city gates. In other words, it is related to their minds, their actions, hands, the whole domestic realm, which is on the doorposts of their house, and then on the city gates, the whole civic realm, the political realm, the social realm. The word of God, the love of God will permeate all of those things. So it is total in its effect. And the word that Paul uses in Ephesians 6, verse 4, that we often refer to, or I do it anywhere, right, to talk about this holistic education, is the Greek word Paideia. When he says, Father, educate your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. So children, obey your parents so they may go well with you. Fathers, there you go. Paideia is one of the words, and the other is nouthesia, to reform their minds. Articulates Romans 12, verse 2. No longer be conformed to the pattern of this world, but rather be transformed by the renewal of your minds. The charge that the reformers will make of Catholic education is that they are conforming to the pattern of this world. That's the charge. You can read the Greeks, you can read the Romans, you can read them in the original, you can cite them, but you are conforming to the pattern of this world by simply reading them and not by going to the text where the greatest light is to be found first, and with the grace of faith. So Milton nails his banner to the mast here, and then goes on to say this: but because our understanding cannot in this body found itself but on sensible things, nor arrive so clearly to the knowledge of God and things invisible, as by orderly conning over the visible and inferior creature, the same method is necessarily to be followed in all discrete teaching. So it needs to be presented in a form that it recognizes that we are embodied beings. Very important. And you're going to find that, and it's one of the shocking things about Milton's treatise, he recommends a rigorous course of physical education for the pupils. It's shocking when you think of how intellectual Milton is, that it's one of the three things that jumps out about it, but it's constant. And it would be for boys, by the way, he's talking about here, I think, when he's talking about this. And I can tell you, having a young boy, that boys need physical education. It's just like they have so much energy naturally, and if it's not harnessed, they can't concentrate. And they're not ADD, that stupid diagnosis. They're just boys. It's like this perverse, as if everyone was the same and male and females were the same and they act the same and they need to be taught the same way. No, boys have different requirements, and it doesn't denounce the boys any more than it denounces the girls. That's the way they are. You have to do this. But Milton certainly does emphasize the physical aspect of this, and he says that right over, that we need this because we cannot found itself but on sensible things. Then we have to follow the same in discrete teaching. And furthermore, and here's the limitation on this, seeing every nation affords not experience and tradition enough for all kind of learning, which is simply a fact, and since we don't have an infinity of time in which to teach our young, we will go to those who are most renowned for wisdom. That's it. It's not saying that you can't learn anything from every culture and every nation. There's gold to be found in every culture. But there are nations that are more reputed for wisdom. There's more gold there, to use Augustine's analogy. Therefore, we are chiefly taught the languages of those people who have at any time been most industrious after wisdom, so that language is but the instrument conveying to us things useful to be known. And though a linguist should pride himself to have all the tongues of the Babel cleft the world into, yet if he have not studied the solid things in them, as well as the words and lexicons, he were nothing so much to be esteemed a learned man, as any yeoman or tradesman competently and wise in his mother dialect only. So if you know some archaic tribal language, we will no more account you wise than somebody who works in the trades and knows nothing but his native tongue, because there's no knowledge in that, there's no wisdom in that language, in that people group, or there's a relatively minor bit. So we're not going to esteem you wise for that, although it will take you great pains to do that. And I'm not disparaging the learning of other languages, but it's not the general course of education. It might be something that Wycliffe will want to do to get you to translate the Bible into other vernaculars. That's something that an individual may take upon himself. But he's talking about the education of the aristocrats and people in general. You want to go where the greatest quantity of gold is, and gold is the wisdom of God as it's been expressed in their culture. And he says, hence appear the many mistakes which have been made learning generally so unpleasing and so unsuccessful. First, we do amiss to spend 7 or 8 years merely in scraping together so much miserable Latin and Greek, as might be learned otherwise easily and delightfully in 1 year. Oh, how are you going to do that? It's not by doing 8 times the work and compacting it in 1 year. There's going to be a methodology to the acquisition of the language. They'll make it delightful. Note that he's going to make it delightful. The education is not just teaching, but it is delighting. That's an aspect that we'll find is always woven into the classical tradition, that education, or even good poetry, does both teach and delight. It has to do both. Young children have to delight in what they're doing. It should be fun for them. You can make it fun for them. You can make it a game. There are ways of doing this. You can chant. You can sing. You can have competitions. There are various ways, and they will make learning, and we're having fun here. And yet, along the way, at the end of it all, they have, lo and behold, attained in 1 year what they would otherwise, through repetition and bang, 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 learning, would have taken 8 years, and come away with a worse knowledge. And that which casts our proficiency therein so much behind is our time partly lost in too oft idle vacancies given both to schools and universities, partly in a preposterous exaction, forcing the empty wits of children to compose themes, verses, and orations, which are the acts of ripest judgment, and the final work of a head filled by long reading and observing, with elegant maxims and copious invention. These are not matters to be wrung from poor striplings like blood out of the nose, or the pluckings of untimely fruit, besides the ill habit which they get of wretched barbarizing against the Latin and Greek idiom with their untutored anglicisms, odious to be read, yet not to be avoided without a well-continued and judicious conversing among pure authors digested, which they scarce taste, whereas if after some preparatory grounds of speech by their certain forms got into memory, they were led to the praxis thereof in some chosen short book lesson through to them, they might then forthwith proceed to learn the substance of good things and arts in due order. So get right away into conversing in the language through a simple book that they can read, enjoy, whatever, and delight in. You don't have to memorize copious quantities of classical authors. Get doing it. I know that the new apps, Duolingo, Babbel, all those sorts of things, they're doing this effectively already. They're giving you, I don't think that they're, the be all and end all, but they get you immediately hearing, speaking, and memorizing things. You're immediately active and involved. That's what he's talking about. It's not, you read it on a page, you read the rote. No children will enjoy that. It ought to be delightful to the child. Children naturally are excitable. That's something you got to use. You have to use the excitement. Don't kill it. A lot of education is killing excitement, throttling it in the cradle. But note that the practical aspect is emphasized here. And he then goes on to say that they are pushed to logic and metaphysics long before they are able to handle it even. Quote from Prelusion, what about logic? That is indeed the queen of the arts, if taught as it should be, but unfortunately how much foolishness there is in reason. Its teachers are not like men at all, but like finches which live on thorns and thistles. Logic should be enjoyable. A good teacher will make logic delightful. And it is the queen of the arts. Note that it's not the queen of the sciences, but of the arts, by which he means the trivium. Anyway, go on. But that key text, the end then of learning is to repair the ruins of our first parents, but regaining to know God aright, is there. As for the usual method of teaching arts, have I skipped over this already? I have not. Ooh, it's a different, it doesn't have the pause that I want. Where is this then? There it is. Okay, I have it as a different, as a paragraph in my rendering here. As for the usual method of teaching arts, I deem it to be an old error of universities, not yet well recovered from the scholastic grossness of barbarous ages, that instead of beginning with arts most easy, and those be such as are most obvious to the sense, they present their young unmatriculated novices at first, coming with the most intellective abstractions of logic and metaphysics, so that they having but newly left those grammatical flats and shallows where they stuck unreasonably to learn a few words with lamentable construction, and now on the sudden transported under another climate to be tossed and turmoiled with their unballasted wits and fathomless and unquiet deeps of controversy. So they get immediately into the abstractions of metaphysics but they're thrown into the deep end. They just simply can't handle it because they're not starting with simple things, because the simple things boil down. Well, look at the command to love. It's a very simple and easy command. All children can be taught that. And the appreciation in that, so in other words, it's age and stage specific education then. If the child understands in a very limited sort of way, start with that. You don't have to take them up to a philosophical abstraction which the teacher is interested in but is above the pupils' heads, and the teacher is not teaching at all. It's like a monologue. So note the practical emphasis of Milton's recommendation. So this is the thing that's striking about it, is how strong the emphasis is on practicality. And I think it's surprising because he has us reading all sorts of ancient languages, which seems the opposite of practical, like Aramaic and so forth. But I'll go back to this. For their studies. Okay, so where is this? Oh, actually, let's talk about the setting. This is good. And he has interest in the setting. Like, what's the building going to be like? So it's not just the curriculum. What is the housing going to be like? Find out a spacious house and ground about it fit for an academy. He has in mind Plato's Academy. And big enough to lodge 150 persons, whereof 20 or thereabout may be attendants, all under the government of one, so there'll be a principal, who shall be thought of desert sufficient and ability either to do all or wisely to direct and oversee it done. So you could have one person educating 150. Boy, that would be a thing. And if not, then he can direct the others to do it. So there needs to be somebody of accomplishment who can be the principal to do this. But they have to be, note that the person concerned is not an administrator, he is a teacher. Also key, the principal is the master teacher. This place should be at once both school and university, not needing a remove to any other house of scholarship. So a high school with 120 can also be a university. You don't need to separate the two. Not needing to remove to any other house of scholarship except it be some peculiar college of law or physic, where they mean to be practitioners. But as for those general studies which take up all our time, from Lily to the commencing, as they term it, Master of Arts, it should be absolute. Everything takes place in one building. You don't need to specialize infinitely. After this pattern, as many edifices may be converted to this use as shall be needful in every city throughout this land, which would tend much to the increase of learning and civility everywhere. This number, less or more, thus collected to the convenience of a foot company or interchangeably two troops of cavalry, should divide their day's work into three parts as it lies orderly: their studies, their exercise, and their diet. Very practical. Note the small scale. Note he's talking about city campuses, Christian halls, all dotted around the country. Oxford and Cambridge universities began not as the universities, they began as little halls or colleges. Like a couple of scholars gathered together, banded together, and pupils came to them. And Oxford and Cambridge, just like Paris and other places, were renowned for having scholars there, and they had pupils that would come to them, and they were the foundation of the universities. Now, the universities now have thousands of people. They began in small little campuses, and arguably, and this is Milton's argument, that education should not be confined to Oxford and Cambridge. It should be in every city throughout England. And if you want to, by extension, same here. Every little city, every little town should have a campus where it has a school, and it will also then have a university that grows out of that. And it will then, it will be small in number. And the smallness of the cadre is important to the identity of it, and also to the personal aspect of the educative process, because there's character education going on here as well. So 3 aspects: studies, exercise, diet. I said there were 3 features. The studies is the one that people normally pay attention to, but he talks as much about the exercise and diet, which is a bit of a shocker, I think, at least coming from Milton. For their studies, first, they should begin with the chief and necessary rules of good grammar. Either that now used or any better, and while this is doing, their speech is to be fashioned to a distinct and clear pronunciation, as near as may be to the Italian, especially in the vowels. Now, there's Milton's own taste here, because he's from England, and if you go around England, they have all manner of dialects and pronunciations, and some of them he finds clearly barbarous. So he has in mind a English speech, which is something akin to what we have in Britain now. There's a received pronunciation. It's the speech that the monarch speaks. That is what the aristocrats should learn, be taught to speak, as opposed to the local forms of speaking. You will find the same in European countries now is in general. So in Germany, they have something they call High German, which they teach in German classes throughout the country. Even though they speak in a local dialect, they learn High German in schools. So they use 2 types of German: the ones that they normally speak and understand in the local, and then what the educated speak, which is still the same language, but it's a certain articulation of it, which the educated speak. Same thing in Italy. In Italy, they speak the Florentine dialect because Dante was chosen, the Florentine dialect was chosen to be the Italian language. So if you speak Italian, you actually speak Florentine. And if you go to Rome, you're going to find, I didn't understand a word that they just said. But I speak Italian. How come I don't understand the Romans? Well, they're speaking the Roman dialect, that's why. But they learned Italian in school, like you. So I found that in Germany. Same thing in England. All over Europe, the same thing. We don't notice it in North America because it's an immigrant country, and the differentiations of language that accrue over time haven't actually set in here. If somebody's from the deep south of the US, we think they have an accent. That's not even a dialect. You understand every word they say. A dialect, you listen to them and think, I have no idea what they just said. And so you need subtitles. That's when I lived in Germany, I saw the people from Bayern, Bavaria, were given subtitles on the screen. Or Switzerland, same thing, because I have no idea. But that's person speaking in German? Yep. Anyway, so they will learn to speak as near to the Italian. Again, that's a rather weird, quirky thing of him. For we Englishmen, being far northerly, do not open our mouths in the cold air wide enough to grace a southern tongue. Now, there's a purpose here. He may be an Italophile like me, loves Italy, loves the food, loves the culture. But I think it's more he wants a learning which he thinks is more Latinate and more Greek, and therefore he thinks that there's an effect of the northern air and you can't speak some languages without opening your mouth more than we do. The French is the exact same thing. You got to use your tongue a lot more. You have to use your mouth a lot more. Whereas Canadians, they barely open their mouths when they speak. Talk about the cold air in England. So that to smatter Latin with an English mouth is as ill a hearing as law French. Next, to make them expert in the usefulest points of grammar, when withal to season them and win them early to the love of virtue and true labor. Ere any flattering seducement or vain principle sees them wandering, some easy and delightful book of education should be read to them. Whereof the Greeks have store, as Cebes, Plutarch, and other Socratic discourses. You ever read Plutarch? You should read Plutarch. Frankenstein reads it in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Reads Plutarch's Lives. Much read in the 19th century. Really entertaining. Compares Julius Caesar to Alexander the Great. It's that sort of thing. I'll take a Greek, I'll take a Roman. We'll look at them alongside of each other. And these are education books. They're comparative. And these are famous figures. Boys love hearing about generals and leaders and battles, and that's how you do it. But there's education going on because these men were, Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander the Great. You want to be like Alexander the Great? Well, then be a learned man. I'm going to run out of time here already. I see you talking. And the next would be authors of agriculture. Isn't this interesting? So he assumes that these aristocrats are going to be connected to their estates, and they're going to understand what they actually do. They're farmers. They may be representing their bodies in parliament, but they still have a farm to run. They have to understand that. You wouldn't expect this from Milton again, but it's intensely practical education. And ere half these authors be read, which will soon be with plying hard and daily, they cannot choose but be masters of ordinary prose. So it just comes not by testing, but by osmosis. If you read good books regularly in a delightful way, you imbibe it and you learn it and you know it inside out very quickly. And if you really like it, you'll read it again and you'll read it again. And children at that age are just like sponges. So he recommends reading good books, great books early on. Don't overwhelm them. You don't have to do everything that's been written. Do something good, get them into the habit of delighting and learning, and then move them on. Then he will move from arithmetic to geometry, astronomy, and geography with a general compact of physics, in other words, the Quadrivium. They may descend in mathematics to the instrumental science of trigonometry, and thence to fortification, architecture, enginery, or navigation. So applied aspects of the Quadrivium. You can get into things like engineering and architecture and navigation and creating engines, which is also an aspect of engineering now. And in natural philosophy, they go from history on to other things, etc. And by this time, years and good general precepts will furnish them with more distinctly the act of reason, which in ethics is called proairesis. You can distinguish good from evil. Note how it relates back to what he said in Areopagitica. It doesn't have to be pushed down their throats. It's going to come from reading these books. They're already imbibing it quietly, secretly. It doesn't need to be hammered on their heads. It's there. They can already judge it. How is that? Because they have the Tao. They already know right from wrong. And the texts make it clear. The great authors also instruct us in that. That's how it happens. I'm going to run out of time here, and I said I would do that, and I knew I would do that. But then he will go on to different dialects, and then he talks about Chaldean and Syrian and different, and reading Demosthenes and Cicero and Euripides and Sophocles. That comes much later on. Read Winnie the Pooh in Latin. Winnie Illy Pooh. It exists. Like, read a child's book in Latin. Same in Greek. And you can read it side by side even. And you quickly, I learned German this way. This will sound really odd. I read Nietzsche though, so it's not quite the same. But here's Nietzsche in German. I have an English copy of Nietzsche, and I'm going back and forth, and all the German words that I don't know, I write down. And I'm just reading and reading and reading, and find it really interesting and also sometimes outrageous. But I think, okay, and I'm engaging with a text that I have enough interest in, and thereby it's pulling me in and it's making it easy for me rather than just repeat, and same word, memorize words. Oh, terrible. Get reading as quickly as you can. Read a text that you are interested in. And you will take delight in that, and you will softly be drawn into knowing a lot more than you already know. That's his method there. Very practical. And he says if you do this, you can learn Greek and you can learn any number of languages. That's not how they're taught here at Tyndale. I know that. I was not taught in universities that way, but it works. I can tell you. Anyway, but note, so the features of it are the emphasis on repairing the knowledge of the ruins of our first parents, and loving him and being like him, who again loves his neighbor, and possessing of true virtue. That's the end goal here, possessing true virtue. And with that true virtue, then you can become like John Milton and read texts and dispute and slay dragons and dispute falsehoods, etc. Anyway, that's the aim of the education. It's small scale, and it is very practical, though, I think, in its intent. I'm not going to get to the diet. You can read on the diet if you want. I think I can skip over that. But he's interested, and he thinks it matters. He also says that you should do physical exercise, and then you should play music before lunch, that sort of thing. He gets into the practicalities of the rhythms of the day, when boys are willing to study. You got to run them for a while, get their energy out, and now you get them sit down and they're willing to do this for a while, and then you got to run them again, and then you can sit them down, they have something to eat, and you listen to music, and all of that. It's following the natural rhythms of their bodies. That's how you educate. It's pleasant. Done.